The Soviet Union's first attempt at producing a radar-equipped night fighter was when they fitted domestically developed half-ton Gneiss-2 radars into PE-3 heavy fighters. These were used in limited numbers to attack German nocturnal cargo flights into Stalingrad in 1942 and then over Moscow and Leningrad in the summer of 1943. But they were found to have limited effectiveness due to the weak armament of the PE-3, the performance compromises that came with lugging that half a ton around, and the fact that the radar could only give direction instructions. Actually spotting the enemy in time to engage required a lot of pilot skill. By 1944, the Soviet Air Force had come to the same conclusion as the RAF some years earlier, and elected to install a modified set into the Douglas Havocs they'd been sent via Lend-Lease. These were apparently more successful, but as only 250 radar sets were produced, they were only really available in small numbers. In the immediate post-war period, the lack of a competent radar-equipped night fighter became a growing issue for the Politburo. The effectiveness of massed RAF night raids over Germany remains a polarizing subject. One way or another, the advent of the atomic age meant that even a single bomber could devastate a city, industrial or military facility, even if it only managed to drop a weapon vaguely near the target. Developing such an aircraft meant both finding a sufficiently high-performance, high-altitude platform that could get to US B-36s and an airborne radar that would direct their destruction. After 3 years of rather disappointing jet fighters, in 1949 the MiG-15 emerged into daylight. It would ultimately be manufactured in vast numbers and put its designers on the map by way of its performance in Korea. The radar was much more troublesome, though. Two distinct lines of development were pursued, one that used a single antenna and set of avionics to perform both search and gun sight functions, and another that split those two into two connected systems. MiG's first choice for an intercept radar to equip the MiG-15 was a custom set with a single antenna developed by MiG-17, the electronics OKB that would design many of the early fighter radars in the Soviet Union. This was the Tori or Thorium set designed by A.B. Slipushkin. Thorium was an ambitious piece of technology, but unfortunately it lacked critical automations required to hold a track on the target. That meant that the pilot had to find his target, keep an eye on it on the screen while adjusting the analog electronics and flying the plane. Since 4 hands and 2 heads were atypical amongst Soviet aviators, the level of multitasking required was a limitation. On the plus side, having a single antenna meant that aerodynamic modifications to the MiG-15 were relatively simple to execute. Although the ultimate MiG-15 SP would be based on the BIS, the prototype was built from a very early MiG-15. The 9 front frames of the aircraft were redesigned to house the antenna in a bulbous radome at the top of the air intake. In order to increase performance, the aircraft's original RD-45F engine was replaced with the more powerful VK-1 from the BIS, entailing a redesign of the rear fuselage as well, into something more BIS-like. A larger generator was fitted to power the radar, and the cockpit was modified to include the radar screen and a PKI-1 collimating gun sight. The latter was a more advanced type than the standard MiG-15 sight, and it would later appear on the Tu-22 blinder. Because weight had been added at the front of the aircraft, the nose gear was moved forward 3 inches, necessitating new doors. The balance issues also meant that larger air brakes were needed. The wings were mounted with 3 degrees of extra anhedral, and a hydraulic booster was installed in the aileron control circuit to give greater control authority. Weight gain was now a real problem, given the need to both have a controllable and a high-performance aircraft. To bring it down, the 2 23mm cannons in the gun pack and their ammunition were removed, leaving just the single 37mm NR-37 cannon with 45 rounds. For stability, the gun was moved close to the centerline. The prototype was completed in April 1949 and flown by MiG test pilots until late January 1950. Unfortunately, the issues with wing drop that blighted the MiG-15 were very much in evidence with the SP-1. The boundary layer fences were reinforced in an attempt to increase torsional strength, but the issue was not cured and the aircraft had to be flown carefully at higher speeds. But this was not the biggest issue with SP-1. The radar was unreliable in general. It particularly disliked low current, so when engine RPM dropped below 8,000, it tended to switch off at random. It would also glitch when the cannon was fired. Even when it did work, pilot workload was too great to make the SP-1 viable, unless the Air Force concluded that a second crewman came along to guide the pilot on the intercept. MiG therefore switched radar sets in June 1950, backing another MiG-17 project called the RP-1 Izumrud, or Emerald. This was developed by Tikhomirov and it had twin radar antennas. Having two antennas meant a more significant redesign of the MiG-15's front end in the SP-5 prototype used to test it. The search antenna is in a fattened and extended upper intake lip. The tracking radar is in a bullet-shaped installation at the center of the intake splitter. This arrangement would be how MiG installed various versions of Izumrud in its tactical fighters for the next decade. 15 equipment modules were crammed into the nose behind it, and the windshield was redesigned in the same way as it had been in the SP-1 in order to accommodate the radar display. MiG-15s had, as standard, the ASP-3 or 3N gun sight. These were reverse-engineered copies of the British Mark IID gyro-lead computing gun sights, which the Soviets had obtained via Lend-Lease. Using that sight required the pilot to set the target's wingspan and then his estimated range to the target. The sight then showed the aiming point via a system of lenses, projecting it into the pilot's field of view. It was actually a good system when used by the RAF and later developed both by them and the US manufacturers. The Soviets had, however, been unable to develop their own sights because Stalin had a particular distaste for anybody involved in the physics of optics and had them all killed. Although ingenious at reverse engineering, they didn't fully understand how the Mark IID worked, and therefore failed to adjust its mechanical computer for the different shell weights and ballistics of the cannons that Soviet aircraft were using. In the MiG-15, this resulted in two streams of shells, one 37mm and one 23mm, that would bracket the target rather than hitting it directly. Some Soviet pilots therefore used the fixed sight option and worked out their own firing solution. In the SP-5, the Izumrud system used the optical components of the MiG-15's AS-3N gun sight to give the pilot instructions. It was like a primitive heads-up display, and it worked by using a system of mirrors to reflect light from the radar CRT on the console up into the gun sight. The CRT was a high-retention time unit, and it allowed the pilot to search for targets and keep mental track of more than one at a time. The S-band RP-1 had originally been regarded as an insurance policy against failure of the Tori system, but it became the main system when Tori's limitations became clear. To make an interception, the pilot was initially guided by ground control. A Barry M IFF was fitted for target identification. As the pilot closed on an enemy, he would switch on the radar in search mode. When the RP-1 detected a contact, a blip with a distinctive shape would be shown on the gun sight. It would be a T if the enemy was above the fighter's altitude, an inverted T if it was below, or a plus shape if it was at the same level. The pilot was aiming to get that plus shape so that the target entered the radar's auto-tracking zone. This was a 7-degree cone ahead of the nose, extending out to about 1.25 miles. When the gun sight showed a central spot with wings either side, known to pilots as the bird, then the radar computer was in auto-track. When he closed in, the computer would indicate when to fire. I'm not clear for the symbology for this, though, nor for showing how to lead the target, which was also supposedly a function. Once again, in order to reduce weight, the weapons load was reduced. This time, however, two NR-23 cannons were carried, one on either side of the gun tray. The installations were asymmetrical, with the port gun further back, its nozzle barely exposed ahead of the leading edge of the tray. The starboard gun protruded and had only 90 rounds of ammunition versus 120 for the port gun. The gun camera was relocated, but the nose gear on the SP-5 was in this case standard. Flight testing of the aircraft began in late August 1950, but the challenges of building and setting up the Izumrud radar meant that radar performance tests didn't begin until the end of July 1951, with state trials beginning in August. The overall system was judged to be effective. Izumrud gave equivalent accuracy of lead computation to the standard gyro-based ASP-3N in daytime, and it was between 6 and 7 times more effective than Tori at night thanks to the superior automation. But although it was accepted for service, the arrival of the MiG-17 on the production line meant that no production MiG-15 all-weather fighters would be built. The intricate but delicate system of mirrors that made the optical sight work also proved too much for mass manufacturing and field maintenance and would therefore also be shelved at this stage. In 1952, however, work did begin on a pair of prototype radar training aircraft based on the UTI MiG-15. These were completed in August 1953. One of them was lost in a failed spin recovery trial in September, significantly delaying the second aircraft until April 1954. It was eventually fitted with the RP-3 radar destined for the MiG-17P, with the radar operator's station in the back seat. Changes were quite significant versus the original UTI, including removal of the number 1 fuel cell and installation of heavier duty landing gear. The generator was upgraded and most of the avionics moved around to incorporate the additional systems. Armament was a single 12.7mm machine gun, which was good enough for radar-directed shooting trials. Although having the rear seater directing the intercept seems to have obvious merits, the UTI MiG remained an avionics testbed and no more were built. There was no two-seat version of the MiG-17 planned, but the need for a mass of point defense all-weather night fighters remained, so the single-seat aircraft was used as the basis for the next MiG night fighter. Its development also began in 1949 as the Council of Ministers anticipated the need for both day and all-weather versions of the next tactical fighter and ordered prototypes of both versions at the same time. Because the weaknesses of the Tory radar system were not yet known, MiG developed the first radar-equipped MiG-15-45, as the MiG-17 was then known, with a single antenna. The MiG-17 SP-2 was designed to carry the Korshun or kite radar, which had superseded the Tory NII-17. Like the original, it lacked automatic target tracking and therefore required superhuman pilots. Development was inevitably rather slower than the MiG-17 day fighter, the first prototype of which flew in January 1950. Design of the night fighter was only 75% complete by this point, and only 20% of the aircraft had been constructed in MiG's workshop. SP-2 had identical wings, tail, and aft fuselage to the day fighter. The front fuselage was a MiG-17 version of the SP-1 design, with a bullet-shaped fairing above the intake. Because the MiG-17 was designed to have such a fairing out of the gate, it was better blended into the fuselage than that of the SP-1, but the basic idea was the same. The gun camera was on the starboard side of the intake, and the armament was twin 23mm NR-23s, one on each side of the gun tray. It was the same tray as the one used with the SP-5. A collimating PKI-1 gun sight was fitted for gun aiming, and the radar display was once again mounted in the pilot's field of view, requiring a different windshield to be fitted. De-icing equipment was also there, reflecting the fact that the aircraft would need to take off and operate in hostile conditions. 100 extra litres of fuel was carried to extend range a little over the regular MiG-15 BIS-45. SP-2 flew for the first time in March 1951. Its radar was installed in October, and it began state trials in late November. Findings were exactly as you'd expect. The platform was superior to the MiG-15. When it worked, which was relatively rarely, Korshun was superior to Tory, which was also unreliable. But neither was of any real operational use because of the pilot workload that was required. It was also found that the speed brakes were inadequate to slow the aircraft as it closed on a slower bomber, particularly given that in many situations the pilot wouldn't spot his target until the last second. Taking off with the big drop tanks needed for any patrol was also a bit complicated as the run was long and the aircraft flew poorly. SP-2 was therefore a dead end, albeit a fruitful one from a research perspective. Development of the eventual MiG-17P was essentially an independent process to that of the SP-2. It began in 1952 and the aircraft was known as SP-6, a designation that makes it reasonably certain that it was regarded as an outgrowth of the MiG-15 SP-5. Because the Izumrud had proved to be effective in the MiG-15, the MiG-17P, equipped with the RP-1, was ordered into production in May 1952, before a prototype had even been completed. The setup was the same as that of the SP-5, although the fat upper intake lip, which had a downturned leading edge in the experimental MiG-15 SP-2, was straightened out in the MiG-17P. As I mentioned earlier, the mirror system was removed in the MiG-17P in favour of a separate display that sat next to the gun sight. The attack sequence remained the same. Detection range against a Tu-4 was theoretically up to 6 miles, but in reality more like 5. In daylight, pilots were taught to use the gyro gun sight for the final attack rather than RP-1. Because of its superior aerodynamics, and because it had been expected to only ever be equipped with the afterburning VF-1F engine, the MiG-17P had 3 23mm cannons rather than 2, each with 100 rounds. 2 guns were on the port side and 1 on the starboard. I should probably say that it was intended to have 3 NR-23s. Some of the earliest Ps had the same 37mm and 2 23mm cannons as the day fighter Fresco, and apparently some had just 2 23mm like the SP-5 due to a lack of weapon availability. Like the day fighter, it could carry a pair of 250kg bombs if needed. Lack of availability of the afterburning VK-1F meant that a VK-1A powered aircraft was required as an interim. A quick point on the engine is that all Ps have a self-contained starting system that uses a high-capacity battery to start the engine up to 25 times before recharging. I believe that some of the day fighters also had this facility, but because PVO doctrine was for interceptors to be able to scatter to less well-equipped fields to extend interceptor coverage, all Ps needed it. The engine could obviously also be started from an external power cart using the same BF-109 derived connector as the MiG-15. More important than self-starting is the flexibility that was built into the MiG-17P and later upgrades of the design. The contemporary, broadly analogous F-86D Saberdog traded all flexibility for a very specialized single-mission weapon system consisting of folding fin aircraft rockets. It was vastly more sophisticated in avionics terms, but needed a significant support network as well as ideal conditions to be effective. The MiG-17P was a MiG-17 with a radar. Although crude in comparison to the Saberdog, it would prove more effective and thus longer lived. NATO saw it before the Frescos C afterburner-equipped day fighter, which had actually preceded the P into service, so MiG-17P is Fresco B. Just 225 MiG-17Ps were built, with service entry in 1954. Low build numbers reflected the fact that 2 parallel lines of development were underway as it began to fly in defense of the motherland. The first of these carried over the changes required to implement an afterburner to the day fighter onto the MiG-17P to create the MiG-17PF. Adding the afterburner had limited impact on top speed, which was up about 20 miles an hour to 700. The main benefits were in climb rate at medium to high altitudes, which doubled. Interestingly, to me at least, pilots of the early MiG-17F were forbidden from using their afterburner at low levels because of overheating concerns. This doesn't appear to have applied to the PF, whose pilots were able to use the afterburner on takeoff. Whether this was because operational use had demonstrated that the heat issue wasn't serious, or some modification to the engine that had been rolled out isn't clear to me. In any case, fully loaded takeoffs were now less problematic. Production orders were placed in January 1954 and the first aircraft were delivered later that year. MiG-17PF was produced in greater numbers than the P. 668 were made, limited by supply of radars rather than demand for the aircraft, which was particularly attractive to foreign air arms. Over 300 functionally identical Shenyang J-5As were built under license in China, where they served into the early 1990s. NATO called them Fresco D. MiG called them SP-7. MiG-17PFs were not a single homogeneous mass. The first major iteration of the design involved an improved RP-1 radar and relocated avionics boxes intended to simplify maintenance on the ground. These were SP-7A to MiG. From December 1955, the PF was fitted with the Izumru 2 or RP-5 radar. These late production aircraft were known as SP-8. They had larger intake center bodies to accommodate the larger radome. RP-5 was known as Scan-Odd by NATO because of its complex scanning pattern. It was a better set than RP-1, but it was not desperately sophisticated. This image shows the refresh rate of the CRT from a later MiG-17. Smooth it is not. There's lots of clutter as well. Imagine trying to pick out a contact at a glance with this set. Maximum detection range on the RP5, if you were skilled and lucky enough to be in perfect conditions, was about 7 miles. It was a pulse set with no look-down capabilities. Soviet radars at this time offered about half the range of contemporary US sets. This was the version of the aircraft that was built under license in Poland as the LIM-5P. 129 were made for Poland and another 40 for East Germany. 5 aircraft went to Indonesia and 2 to Bulgaria, presumably to supplement Soviet-built examples. A small number of the very last MiG-17 PFs also had command link radars for the Gorizont 1 GCI system. These were MiG-17 PFG for obvious reasons. When the MiG-19P radar-equipped version of the Farmer passed its state trials and then entered production, it became obvious that the almost brand new MiG-17 PFs were already rapidly becoming obsolete. MAP considered altering the specification of the last MiG-17s being built to include the capability to launch the K-5 Alkali beam-riding air-to-air missile, but decided instead to develop a mid-life upgrade program for the earlier RP-1 equipped aircraft. 40 of these upgrades were performed, creating the MiG-17 PFU or Fresco E. These aircraft had 4 pylons, 2 under each wing, but no cannons. To launch the missiles, the pilot flew within auto-tracking range of the target. He then placed the reticle over the target and held it there before launching a missile. The K-5 flew for a second until its gyros stabilized, then followed the radar beam to the target. It had all of the accuracy and range limitations of any beam-riding missile, but against a non-maneuvering target, it was probably more effective than attempting to use cannons. The PFU was built in limited numbers and it had very limited capabilities. It served until the early 1960s. MiG-17P and PF combat records are quite hard to research, as the subtype is generally lumped into other MiG-17s. Once the teething problems were largely dealt with, they entered service around the Soviet periphery. Soviet GCI tactics were still being worked out in the middle 1950s. Gaps in coverage and insufficiently aggressive operators were routinely exploited by US and British reconnaissance aircraft. But as the situation improved, so did the MiG's effectiveness. On the 19th of May 1954, an RB-47 Stratojet was intercepted near Arkhangelsk. Shots were fired by a brand new MiG-17 PF, but the US aircraft was able to escape. Skirmishes continued. In 1956, U-2s began to appear. These were frustrating opponents for MiG-17Ps, which could climb to the lower reaches of the U-2's operating envelope but couldn't actually make an intercept. Because of the slow pace of development and construction of new interceptors, Soviet pilots experienced such frustrations for years. They found a more attainable but perhaps not a legitimate target on the 27th of June 1958. The US Air Force C-118, reportedly on a regular supply flight from Wiesbaden, West Germany to Karachi in Pakistan via Cyprus and Iran, crossed the Soviet border near Yerevan. 2 Soviet MiG-17 pilots shot the aircraft down 30 kilometers south of Yerevan. 5 crew members parachuted to safety and 4 others survived the crash landing on a half-finished airstrip. The crew were captured and later released by the Soviets on July 7, 1958. The aircraft was reported to be the personal aircraft of Allen Dulles, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency. It had carried senior CIA aides to Europe on an inspection trip, and it was in Turkey when it was diverted. Then on the 20th of November 1963, 2 MiG-17Ps of the 12th Independent PVO Air Army were scrambled to intercept a Rockwell Air Commander that had entered Soviet airspace from Iran. The Soviet pilots initially tried to force it down, but as it approached the Iranian border, they elected to shoot it. A burst of cannon fire did the trick, and the air commander crashed, killing 2 of the 3 people aboard, including a US Army colonel. That's the second of only 3 confirmed kills I can find for the MiG-17P, PF, or PFU that wasn't a weather balloon. Soviet, Czech, and East German PFs chased those well into the 1960s. On the subject of frustrating chases, incursions by Taiwanese, or maybe US aircraft purporting to be Taiwanese, were the bane of the People's Republic Air Force High Command in the 1950s and 60s. Poor radar coverage and the size of the country's border made it possible for a relatively slow piston engine aircraft to get in, mooch about, and then get back out. Intercepting them was surprisingly hard, and MiG-17s and J-5s were often thwarted in their pursuits, but now and again they scored a kill. On the night of the 19th of June 1963, above Nanjang, a MiG-17 PF managed to shoot down a ROCAF Lockheed Neptune with its cannons, killing all 14 people aboard. It was the culmination of a long and frustrating chase involving multiple flights of MiGs and several giant Tu-4P night fighters. In 1965, Vietnam received 9 late-model PFs with the RP-5 radar, and did at least attempt to use them in combat. In fact, until MiG-21s arrived, the PF was the VPF's most advanced fighter, albeit one that was at a major disadvantage when engaging US aircraft at night. Vietnamese GCI was still developing when the small detachment of PFs began combat operations. Even so, they clearly engaged US aircraft. The first and only recorded occasion when they came close to downing one was the night of the 3rd of February 1966, when a pilot named Lam Van Lick attacked 2 A-1 Sky Raiders over Cho Ben. He claimed 2 kills, but no Sky Raiders were lost that day, nor any aircraft that night. A handful of Chinese-built J-5As were added to the force in 1966, but their actual employment appears to have been limited. The same is true of the PFs sent to the Middle East to serve in the Egyptian, Iraqi, and Syrian air forces. Hundreds of MiG-17s served in these air arms, but far fewer of the radar-equipped versions. Syria and Iraq both received 20, the former in the late 50s and the latter in the middle 60s. Unfortunately for Syria, their aircraft were stranded in Egypt when the short-lived United Arab Air Force collapsed, and they were subsequently taken by the Egyptians to join their approximately 20 PFs. These were formed into 2 squadrons, and they were active at the time of the 1967 war. At least 2 scrambled against the second wave of Israeli attacks. These were flown from Kabrit by Wing Commander Mamdouh Taliba and Captain Mustafa Hafiz, both of whom had just returned from sorties in conventional MiG-17s when the field was attacked again. Running to the first available jets, which were PFs, they launched straight out from the hangar in Afterburner, taking off from a subsidiary runway. Even so, they were too late to engage that wave of attackers, and they established a cap over the base instead. They didn't have wait too long for action, as another wave of missed airs came in. Unfortunately, at this point, their fuel was critically low. Outnumbered, the 2 pilots avoided a missile, apparently fired by an unseen Mirage, and then engaged in a brief turning fight with the Israelis. Hafiz's MiG was hit 3 times, in the right wing, the tail, and the rear fuselage, but he still succeeded in landing it. A warning light had informed him that a shell had caused a fire in a fuel tank, but he'd used the fire extinguishing system to put it out. That was the end of the war for that particular MiG. It seems likely that a number of MiG-17 PFs were damaged or destroyed in the first day attacks. They no longer appear in Arab accounts of fighting during the War of Attrition, and they seem to have been replaced by radar-equipped MiG-21s quite soon afterwards. The MiG-17 arguably spent most of its career in obsolescence, and the PF is probably the most severe example of this. It was a dynamically good platform, albeit a subsonic one at a time when supersonic fighters were on the verge of entering service in the Soviet Union and the US. But of course, the main problem was its avionics, which lagged significantly behind those of US aircraft. The most direct point of comparison with the PF is, of course, the Saberdog, which entered service in 1951. The next year, it was upgraded with an AN APG-37 radar that could detect a B-29 at up to 20 miles. That's roughly 3 times the range of the Izumrud II and 4 times that of the Izumrud I that equipped most MiG-17 PFs. Discussion of the merits or otherwise of the Saberdog's rocket armament can wait until another day. From a pure avionics perspective, though, the combination of the radar and the E-4 fire control system that automated the final portion of the intercept was vastly superior to what the PF had. Information on availability rates isn't readily available, but there is enough in Soviet accounts about complicated maintenance to suggest that their radars also had their share of issues. In any case, the development of the MiG-15 and the MiG-17 interceptors is an important phase in the history of Soviet jet aircraft development. With the exception of the F-100, The next generation of US fighters would carry radars as standard, meaning that there was no need for all-weather versions. The Soviets, however, would not fit radars to their standard tactical fighters until the MiG-23 debuted in the late 1960s. The MiG-17P and PF therefore led to the MiG-17P and a range of MiG-21 interceptor variants that would serve the Soviet Union and its allies for another 2 decades.